Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today in the first of our development charge meetings. So my name's Glenn Cowan. I'm the CFO for the town. Joining me as panelists today are Melanie Wallhouse, who is our Manager of Development Finance, along with Nancy Neal and Gary Scanlon from Watson and Associates, and of course Nina from our Clerks Department, who, if you've seen our council meetings, also helps us navigate through those as well and is generous enough to offer her time today as well. We also have staff from across various program areas with us as well, from planning, from infrastructure, from community services, who are here to hear feedback as well and offer their support to the discussion as we need as well. And we may have one of our councillors as well, who I know had RSVP'd for it. And so should he join us, I'll make note of that later on as well. So this morning's meeting and discussion is live streamed. It's going to be available on YouTube, and we will be posting it to our Let's Talk page after the discussion as well. So just wanted to make note of that. As for the process itself, the town's development charge bylaw expires in June, which has necessitated the need for the process that we're going through. Our timeline at the outset, just to give you a sense of where this fits into the whole picture, we're having a stakeholder meeting today on February 11th, and I should note that it will be different material on the 2 days. So it might be of interest to join us for the second one, as well as it will be the next step in the process. We do plan to release the background study at the start of March, followed by a public meeting on March 22nd, and ultimately then bringing a bylaw back on May 3rd for council consideration. So with that context in mind, I just really want to emphasize and highlight that all the information you're going to see today on February 11th does remain in draft form. We're very much still working through the process, but we thought it was valuable to bring some of our early findings to this group and to the public to get your feedback as we're working through it, and also to hear your feedback as we continue to formulate what that background study, and then even after that, ultimately what the bylaw will look like as well. So with that in mind, I think it's important to just mention that context, as some of the information may change when you do see it in the more formal versions of the study and the bylaw. As I mentioned, there is a Let's Talk Milton page that's been set up to support the process, and it's available from the town's main landing page at milton.ca. It includes things like the timeline, presentation materials will be posted there along with some of the draft materials. It has information about our existing development charges as well. And probably most importantly, it does provide an avenue to provide either comments or feedback to us through that. So it is a useful place to visit if you haven't yet, and you can also sign up for notifications and that through the process as well through it. On that note, we are going to leave time after the presentation today for comments and questions. And I know a few of you through the RSVP did indicate that you'd like a few moments to speak as well. So we will preserve some time in this meeting after Gary's had a chance to go through his presentation, and we'll take as many as we can. In the event that if we have to run short on time, or if there's things that come to mind after, please use the Let's Talk page, and we'll certainly see it through that avenue. And I do notice now, I did mention we may have one of our town councillors join us. I'd just like to welcome Councillor Best, who I see has just joined our attendees list as well. So welcome, Councillor. As mentioned earlier, Gary Scanlon and Nancy Neal are from Watson and Associates, and they've been retained to lead this exercise for the town. I'm going to turn it over to Gary to walk us through our slide deck for today. Gary, Nina will control the slides, so if you just want to flag to her when you're ready to proceed through them, she'll lead the way there. And for all the attendees, throughout the slide, if questions come to mind, or if you realize you'd like to be added to the speakers list, if you can use the chat function, I'll keep an eye out and add anyone who'd like to speak, or if there's just questions you want to type in, I'll see it through the chat and can add it to Gary's list at the end as well. So without any further delay, Gary, the floor is yours. And again, thanks everyone for finding time this morning for this.
Great, thank you, Glenn. Pleasure to be here. As Glenn noted, happy to answer any specific questions as we're proceeding through. And subsequent to this, the document will be available to everybody to have access to. Next slide, please, Nina. So we're just going to cover a variety of topics. For those that are somewhat new to development charge process, we'll give you an overview on the calculations and some of the rules and regulations around it. There have been, over the course of the last, I guess, 2 years, significant discussions on changes to the Development Charges Act. This was originally released through Bill 108, which was passed in June of 2019. And then we went through 2 other bills, 138 and 197, which made refinements to the Development Charges Act. And we'll go through that because if you look at the bylaw that we have currently, and the prior report, things have changed. So we need to, through this process, update the calculations to conform to the new act. There's a notation there, Bill 213, which is basically in progress, hasn't been adopted yet, but basically it's dealing with exemptions for universities that receive senior level of government funding. So we'll touch on that as well. And then you can see local service, which is basically the developer's responsibility when they're constructing subdivisions, what's included as part of that. So we'll touch on those discussions. That will be detailed in a document which will be made available, I think, subsequent to these discussions, but it'll also be included as part of the DC background study. And you can see we'll touch on the growth forecast and other exemptions and changes potentially to the bylaw that we'll be considering. So if we go to the next slide, I'll go through the details of this. And again, please, Nina. So development charges, the purpose of them is to recover infrastructure which is required to put into place to accommodate growth. And that's both on the residential side and the non-residential side, so employment lands as well as residential lands. Second point is that local service that we talked about. These costs are in, what we include in the development charge is in addition to what the developing landowner will put in as part of their development. So really the Act defines 2 different types of costs. Very localized, local service, which is what they call it in the Act. So local services are the internal roads, sidewalks, street lights, water mains, sewers, storm sewers, etc. Those are, and we define what size and what types of costs will be solely borne by the developing landowner. The development charge picks up those broader costs that are generally outside of the subdivision, and we include that in the development charge. So that's why it's important for us to have a local service policy, so it's clear what the responsibilities are of the developer, and those costs haven't been included in the calculations that we're going to do through this process. The last point just talks about the history of development charges, which are reflected in the bubbles there. And you can see that these charges, number one, have been around since the mid-1950s. So we're talking about 65 years that we've had this. Originally, they were under the Planning Act. They could be imposed when you created a lot, either through subdivision or a severance. And that's where, if you ever heard this term lot levy, that's where it came from, because we can impose that cost when you created a lot. As we've moved forward, there was a lot of case law under the Planning Act. The province weaved that into a piece of legislation in 1989 called the Development Charges Act. And then since that time, we've gone through different refinements and adjustments. And that's what the rest of those bubbles are, is those changes to the legislation. Next slide. And again, please. So just to highlight what's happened in the last few years, we have these different pieces of legislation. So we've given you the name of the act in each of these. When we do when we are going through to discuss the changes, it's a lot simpler just to call it Bill 108 rather than keep saying the More Homes and More Choice Act 2019, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm going to refer to the bills. And if you want to go back and say, What act is that? You can refer to it here. Next slide. So prior to getting that, prior to completing this process, like Bill 197 was put into place in September of last year. So we started with a process with Bill 108 in May, June of 2019, and we finished last September with 197 finalizing all of these changes. The way the Act was constructed, the Development Charges Act was constructed before, was that unless the province legislated services that you can't include, then the municipality would be able to include any service they provided. They've kind of changed it now, and they've come back and said, okay, we will tell you the services that you can include. And if we haven't included it, then obviously you can't provide that service in your DC calculations. Slight difference, but it does for individual firms such as ourselves. It creates some additional review and consideration as part of doing these calculations. So we've highlighted here in blue the services that the town will be including as part of the development charge. At the regional level, there will be other services that they would be considering: water, wastewater, waste diversion, policing, etc. That will be part of their bylaw, but the blue area is what we'll consider through this process. Next slide. So Bill 108, and kind of augmented by 138, provides, well, they put it into place. There was a lot of things that were included in 108, which basically by the time we got in to the end of the process, they were replaced by the different things that were included in 197. So we've got these, if you watch the history of it, these adjustments were kind of bouncing around these three pieces of legislation. So what was left intact in Bill 108 was basically to provide for delayed payments in certain situations. So if you have rental housing or institutional developments, when you come to pay the charge at the time of your building permit, you would pay that off in six equal payments. So you'd pay on the 1/6 of it on the day of the building permit, and then on the anniversary, you can pay for the subsequent payments over time. Now you'll see the last bullet there says that we can charge interest. So if you owe $100, if that's each of your payments, you'd pay $100 today. Next year, it would be indexed, maybe by 2%, maybe by 5%. It varies depending on the municipality. So each of those subsequent payments would be indexed. So you can either pay it now, or you can pay it in installments in those situations. Now, nonprofit housing will be allowed to pay in 21 installments. So a nonprofit corporation, they pay 1/21st of it, so about 4.6% of the payment on the day of the building permit, and then the next 20 years you'll pay another 4.6% of the charge. Those two items were actually a little bit more expanded because they allowed for commercial industrial to pay in 6 equal installments. And that's what 138 did, was actually remove that from Bill 108 and say, okay, you have to pay 100% at the time of your building permit. There's also an additional provision for if you're coming forth with a site plan application or a zoning amendment, that the development charge would be frozen at the time the municipality accepts a full application for site plan or for zoning. Now it's frozen, but it is also subject to the indexing. So if it's $10,000 would be the charge, and these are the services that are included, we wouldn't add any subsequent services, and whatever the quantum is would be indexed annually until the point in time that you get approval for the site plan or the zoning bylaw. Once the approval is given, you have 2 years to basically move ahead with that development. And if you do so within the 2-year period, then you are going to pay the frozen rate plus the indexing. If it goes past 2 years, then whatever the rate is, you lose that frozen rate. It's whatever the rate of the day is, that is what you will pay as your development charge obligation. Okay, as I say, interest is applied to all of those installment payments. Next slide, please. Excuse me. Under Bill 197, this is where they changed the eligible services. Under 108, they started with saying only 8 services were eligible, and then they added potentially 2 more. And as you can see, by the time we got to the end of 197, there's these 2021 eligible services that we showed to you 2 slides back. So that's the expanded level of services. There are certain instances where we might have to create a class of services. Probably the best example is maybe growth-related studies. So maybe an official plan which deals with policies with respect to stormwater, roads, and parks, recreation, and such. So planning studies isn't an exact category, but when we take a look at the official plan, it includes many of the policies that relate to growth and what services and how the services will be provided to accommodate that growth. So we can still include the official plan, but we actually have to break it into subservice components and then add it back in as a class. For the most part, you'll continue to see this class of service, those being growth studies. But if you see the work that we have to do in getting there, there's going to be some adjustments and some more detailed allocations. But at the end of the day, growth studies will still be a component because we'll categorize that as a class of studies so it can once again continue. If you recall, there was a mandatory 10% deduction as part of our calculations. And that calculation basically applied to everything except for water, wastewater, storm, roads, police, fire, and transit. Any other service had a mandatory 10% deduction. So that 10% now has been lifted. So there is no mandatory 10% deduction. The last one was we were also restricted for those 10% services to a 10-year planning horizon. Transit was also included in that 10-year planning horizon. That's been fully lifted for almost every service except for transit. We still, with transit, have to look at a 10-year planning horizon versus a longer planning horizon. So I'll stop there. I think there was a question, Glenn, from Paula.
There was, and Paula, I think I might be better to speak to that one. Your question was, is there an interest rate that's been prescribed for the development charges when they're on a phased payment plan or frozen? And I was just trying to remember whether it was at the start of 2019 or 18, but we did take a report to council that established what for the town the rate would be, and I believe we set it at prime for the town for applying those calculations. So I'm just trying to find if I can get the link on the website, and I'll put it in the chat if I can dig it up for you.
Perfect. All right, so that was a good question, Paula, thank you. And I'd note that between municipalities, this interest rate may differ. So some may select prime, some may select the index that we use for development charges, and then some have selected rates that are higher. I think Peel Region is 5.5%. So it will vary depending on the individual municipality. Okay. And if we can go back, Nina, can we go to the next slide, please? So there was a lot of dialogue on what's called a community benefit charge. And the community benefit charge is actually Section 37 of the Planning Act. And it was in place and it was used by municipalities such as Toronto quite extensively. Mississauga, Markham, Burlington and Oakville used it, a little bit less specific, but it was what was referred to as a bonus zoning charge. Now, when they came out with Bill 108, it was actually quite expanded from where we've ended up at the end of this process. So where they've left a lot more services in the Development Charges Act, they compacted what is allowed for under the CBC. So this community benefit charge, it's a separate process. There's a strategy. They don't call it a background study, they call it a strategy that has to be prepared, public process, so that municipalities have to go through a similar DC process for the CBC. And when they impose a charge under that bylaw, the charge can be no higher than 4% of the market value of the land for certain forms of higher density developments. And the trigger there is that the density, the height, has to be no less than 5 stories, and you have to have no less than 10 units in that particular building, okay? 10 residential units in that building. So it could be a combined commercial, residential, and if it meets this criteria, 5 stories, 10 residential units, then that comes into play for this potential charge. Now we have to go through and take a look at what would be included, and that would be potentially non-DC services. It could be parkland dedication, and there may be other potential projects. So there may be very specific enhanced projects that aren't included in the DC, but they may be more specific to, to that intensification area. So that is not being dealt with in this DC process we're dealing right now. Subsequent to this, the town may consider looking at a CBC charge, but we're not going to talk about it. If they decide to move ahead with it, it'll be a subsequent process, and the town will be in touch with, obviously, all affected landowners to have a discussion on this. Okay, so I'll leave that there. 213, as I say, is something that's it received royal assent in December, but it's focused on amending an exemption, and that exemption applies to basically universities that receive operating funds for their buildings, or they're providing the service, then they would be exempted from the DC. It's been never exactly clear whether they are exempted or not. And obviously there's universities provided under the province, and then there are individual businesses that call themselves a college or a university. So they're trying to clarify what the exemption potentially would relate to. So that bill will define an exemption for the universities. Next slide. So as we take a look at the impact of these recent changes, for the most part, the service standard that we will be looking at, so all services, we have to do this historic service standard. I'll talk about it later, but basically we're only doing it for the services that are non-environmental, so stormwater, and we're not doing it for historically for different types of studies, and transit is a forward-looking service standard. So we won't focus in on that for the historic service standard. We'll be looking at, through this process, outdoor recreation services and the lands associated with that. So we'll be including lands. It's been a little ad hoc, but we're being very specific this time that looking outdoor recreation services, the lands, we can't provide for parks, But then there's outdoor recreation services where we're looking to add the capital needs and the service standards for those in this DC update. The planning horizon for the soft services has historically been 10 years. We'll be considering whether we continue with that 10-year or whether we actually broaden the planning horizon out for a longer period of time. That would include not only the HUS plans, but there's a number of secondary plans that are being considered. So the Britannia, the Egerton area, the Trafalgar, the Milton Education Village. So we'll consider whether we include all of that in our calculations or whether we stick to a 10-year planning horizon. We haven't quite finalized that yet. And then there will be classes of services that will undertake that combined calculation. That'll be for growth studies and for public works operations. Okay, next slide. And so we talked about local service policy, and we'll come back to this in a more detailed. If you look in the 2017 bylaw background study, we've detailed what a local service policy is. So the municipality's been guided by that. Obviously, as we move ahead, we want to see how that all of those different criteria have performed. So there may be minor tweaks to that, which we'll talk about. If there's any input from the development group on how they've seen it performing, and if you want clarification or for the town to consider some refinements, please submit those. We'll consider that as part of moving through this process. Next slide, please. I'm not going to go through the gory details, but generally what the Act requires us to do is, at a very high level, identify the amount, type, and location of growth. So the time horizon is either that 10 years or whether we include all of the development lands. As I say, for transit, we have to look at a 10-year planning horizon and then post-period. So that'll be part of the calculations being done by, actually, Dylan are assisting us in those calculations. The type, obviously, is residential versus non-residential, and then the location, obviously, that helps to define what the individual needs are. So when we look at a Britannia secondary plan, what are the lands that we'll allocate towards parks and outdoor recreation services, and how much in the amenities we put in there. So as I say, the location will help us define those different projects. As we come down, there's the servicing needs and there's the capital cost associated with that. And then from those costs, there are a number of deductions, grant subsidies, other contributions, which there's not a lot right now. Maybe there may be some that come through with a potential, COVID recovery, but we haven't seen any announcements on grants right now, so there's limited. We have to consider benefit to existing amounts that are in excess of the 10-year historic service standards. That historic service standards, we look backwards 10 years, we look at quality, quantity, and that translates into a calculation where there's an upper limit ceiling on what we can recover. So that will be part of the calculation. So if we exceed it, that's where this deduction comes in. We can't exceed that service standard. And then moving from one bylaw to the next, we rationalize the DC reserve fund balances and make the appropriate adjustments to recognize that. Once we have those net costs, we must split them between a residential, non-residential. They could be even further refined. That being non-residential can be split in between, commercial, industrial, institutional, or retail, non-retail. So there could be further refinements of that. And then we basically, in item 6, divide those costs by the original growth to come up with the calculation, the charge. Residential have low, medium, high density types of charges. On the non-residential side, we express it on a cost per square foot. Next slide, please, Nina. This is something for council. Oops. Okay, so it's just a comment from Paula. This is helpful. Bill will make sure his members are aware, and we'll point them to provide any comments. Okay, thanks, Paula. So this is something that council always need to balance. Development charge bylaws are not mandatory, but they are part of the financial tools that are available to municipalities. As growth occurs, it's going to activate the need for additional infrastructure. And it's always a balance for them through this process. Do they recover 100% of the funds they can through the development charge? Or do they do exemptions, reductions, and such, and that translates into transfers back to the existing taxpayer? So if they didn't collect any development charges, then any growth-related works would basically be funded through property taxes, user rates, etc. Next slide, please. Cash flow is always one of the issues with municipalities. In certain instances, if there's a considerable amount of infrastructure that has to be put into place in advance of the development, then the municipality may seek to get into financial arrangements with the developer. Normally, the harder services, water, wastewater, storm, and to some extent roads, a lot of it has to be constructed to accommodate the growth as it's at the front end of those developments. So the municipality either seeks to get into prepayment agreements, front-ending agreements. They could elect to keep the payments at the time of building permit, but then potentially they may have to go out and debenture, get loans for the infrastructure, and then they're allowed to recover the cost of those loans, including interest, as part of the calculation. So cash flow is always something that we discuss with the staff as we're going through this process, and then look to see how the recoveries may find the way into different policies in the DC study. Next slide, please. And again, please. So as we move through, you'll see that these are the services that will be, the first one is town-wide services. So it doesn't matter where you are developing or pulling a building permit out in the town, but you'll be paying towards services related to a highway, which is roads, sidewalks, active transportation, those type of services, public works, fire protection, transit, parks and recreation, and library. On the right-hand side, there are calculations that we'll do on an area-specific basis, and there are currently for their stormwater recoveries with respect to the Boyne, Sherwood, and I think Boyne, Sherwood, and there should have been a Bristol, but maybe the Bristol's finished. So those are related to the HUSP lands. And then we have the potential for the development lands that'll occur in the future, Trafalgar Egerton, Britannia, MEVs, the stormwater related works, and any of the recoveries associated with that would be done on an area specific basis. When we take a look at the very bottom there, you see town-wide classes of service. Once again, these are areas that will be imposed across all of the town. But because of that, the way the Act has been set up, we have to look at a little bit more detail on Public Works Operations Center. Public Works may be sharing with some of the space and the land with parks, outdoor recreation, and perhaps transit. So we have to look at that as a class rather than breaking it apart into individual services. And then I've talked about growth-related studies, how we would approach that. So when we go through, you'll see that we'll be composing the charges on this particular basis. Next slide. And so the growth forecast, historically, it's been predominantly the HUSP lands and the development of the 401 lands and Dairy Green Business Park. So we're looking to potentially include those, what the region's called the Phase 4 lands. And that would include, as I say, the MEV is the Milton Education Village, which is at the very west end of the urban area. We got Egerton and Trafalgar, which is basically at Trafalgar and 401 area. There's the Dairy Green, which is the business park that's more to the east of Thompson Road. 401 Business Park, that's the historic business park and the extension north of the 401. And MEV supplemental lands, which are basically to the south of where the Milton Education Village are. We're also looking at the intensification within the former HUSP lands. So this is the old Milton, and predominantly Main Street, and along that corridor is targeted for more intensification growth. So we'll be looking at that. And there are minor developments in the rural that'll be included as part of the growth forecast. So we've expanded the lands that we're looking at, and obviously the time horizon for the build out of all these developments. Next slide, please. So if we look at it on a 10-year planning horizon, you can see that the net population growth would be 78,800 people, and that would translate into almost 32,000 single, semi, multiple, and apartment units. So a combined almost 32,000. You can see a large portion of that, almost half of that developing units are in the apartment category. We go to the next, which is looking at, in essence, the build out of those lands. You can see we go up to almost 172,000 people, and in total about 66,400 units. Once again, the largest number of units are in the apartment category. So these are the growth forecasts that we'll be using as part of our calculations, and we'll be looking at the servicing needs, obviously, with associated with all of that. Next slide. On the non-residential side, we've given you a similar type of thing, the 10-year versus the build-out. So we've given you commercial broken into retail, non-retail. We've given you industrial, institution. So in total, the employment is about 29,000 people. That's the last column on the right. And that translates into almost 25 million square feet of building space over the 10-year planning horizon. The next slide gives you the longer term. So the build out would be looking at about 57,000 employees, and that's about 43 million square feet of building space. So you can see the associated areas and then the different category of development and the associated square footage. When we give you the details in the background study, we'll also associate the employment increase with each of these areas, but we've summarized it at a higher level right now. Next slide. So mandatory exemptions. So this is what is depicted in the legislation. So these are instances where the municipality cannot impose as a result of the legislation. So we have on the non-residential side, for industrial buildings only, there's a provision that those buildings can expand up to 50% without having to pay a charge. So if I've got a 100,000 square foot building, I can expand it and add an extra 50,000 square feet and not pay the charge to the town. If you have, a 75% increase, you would only pay for the amount that's in excess of the 50%. Now, to be clear, we have drawn a line in the sand historically, and we said, okay, from this point forward, you get 50%, but you only get 50% of the size of the building as of a certain point in time. This is to ensure that we're not getting, I start with a 100,000 square foot building. I take out a building permit and go to 150, take out another one, go to 225, get another exemption, go from 225 to 337,500. So the bylaw is set up that you get up to 50% increase, and then past that, that's it. You get that, it's kind of a one-time up to 50%, and then no further exemptions. There's a local government exemption, so the town can't impose their charges on the region or the school boards for any buildings they construct, and similarly, the school boards and the region can't impose the charge on any new buildings constructed by the town. For existing residential homes, you can add up to 2 additional apartments in your house as long as you don't more than double the size of the original home. So if I got a 12,000 square foot home, I can add 2 600 square foot apartments and not have to pay the charge. If I exceed that, then it activates the charge being warranted. If you're in a medium density, high density existing building, you can add 1 additional unit. Now, what's been highlighted in yellow is a change that has been introduced through the legislation recently, so that when you're building a brand new housing unit, whether it be single, semi, or townhouse, medium density, that you can add 1 additional unit in that housing. So if I'm building a single family home, I can add an apartment in the basement, and that apartment does not have to pay the development charge. It also, or I can either do that, or I can put a unit as an accessory, which would potentially be a granny flat, or maybe I've got a detached garage and I'll put an apartment up there. So, but this is at the time you're coming through with the building permit, you have to apply for that unit. 3 years later, you can't apply and expect that all of a sudden you're going to get an exemption. It has to be part of the process when you're putting in your building permit. So that's new, that's been added. And you can see that the development of lands intended for use by a university that receives operating funds from the government, that's that new section that we talked about, that would have an exemption as well. So those are mandatory. Those will be expressed in the bylaw, and these basically apply to all municipalities across Ontario. When we get into non-statutory, we call it discretionary exemptions, the legislation allows us to put in made in Milton type of exemptions that the municipality feels is important to them to give some form of relief to the development charge. So they can reduce the charge partially or wholly for certain types of, certain classes or certain types of development. So a type would be, let's say, a church. A class would be industrial. They can phase the charges in over time. So maybe the charges are increasing significantly. So maybe they'll phase the charge in over a period of time, give some relief in the transition. And there is in place redevelopment credits. That's to recognize if I knock down my house, I should be given a period of time to replace it. Or if you're in a redevelopment area, maybe I'm going to knock down 3 single family homes, put in 10 townhouses. So I would pay 10 times the townhouse rate, subtract 3 times the single family rate, because I'm replacing to some extent what's there. So that's provided for in the town's charges. So there's no changes to those statutory exemptions that we talked about. Next slide. And these reflect what the exemptions are. So places of worship are exempted. Accessory use buildings not exceeding 10 square meters, so 100 square feet, or 107 square feet, then you're exempted. Accessory use buildings for residential, public hospitals, buildings owned and used by the Conservation Authority, agricultural development. So this is certain types of agricultural that are exempt up to 50 square meters on for a commercial or retail, seasonal structures, and then temporary venues and garden suites. So this is detailed in the definitions in the current bylaw, and we would continue these and it's planned to continue these in the subsequent bylaw. The redevelopment credit, as I talked about, if you knock down a building, then you have up to 5 years to replace that building. Or once you get past, if it's 7, 10, 15 years later, the exemption doesn't apply. The indexing right now occurs on April 1st of every year, and it's set into the bylaw that it's an automatic indexing. So this refers to the StatsCan Construction Cost Index, and this is standard. This is a standard provision in the regulation. So if municipalities want to index, they have to use that that particular index set out for DCs. Next slide. So I think Glenn summed this up in his opening remarks, but just to come back to it, we're going to come back with the service standard calculation. So this is the details, that historic 10 years, quality, quantity, that'll be detailed out in a package to be distributed. The capital program will be there. And then any bylaw refinements to the policies. As I say, there are some adjustments as a result of the new legislation, so you'll be able to see the wording and the detail. So we'll be back with you on February 11th to talk about that. The process, we're going to do a council workshop, bring them up to speed, and to talk about the changes and the preliminary calculations. And then, as we said, there's a mandatory process, minimum 60-day process we have to go through. So we'll release the background study on March 3rd. We'll release the public meeting notice no later than February 28th, but the targeted date is March 22nd. So we have to leave at least 3 weeks notice for the public meeting, and that meets the 3 weeks there. And then we're targeting the bylaw passage for May 3rd. So, this will be how we go through with the mandatory steps. At the same time, we just note that there's a park strategy and a new parkland dedication bylaw. So there were some adjustments through the legislative process at the same time as DCs. So that will be also coming out. That'll help to inform our parks and our outdoor recreation needs. That'll be part of that process. And then the bylaw will make sure that it lines up with the development charge. So that's just an aside. We thought it'd be important for you to be aware of that. I think I saw something again from, do we know?
So Gary, I just provided a quick response for that one, and maybe I'll just speak to it quickly. So Paula, we haven't yet looked up the StatCan reference number for the indexing. So actually, right off the top of my head, I'm not quite sure if that number is even available yet, but we haven't started working on our internal report. Normally, it would be April 1st that the indexing would be applicable for. I think you noted May there. We did delay it last year in response to COVID, and again, because we haven't started the report yet, we haven't had those discussions just yet. But there'll be more information in the month to come, month or two to come.
Yeah, the fourth quarter index, which is what we'd be using, I think comes out any day now. It's normally right at the end of the following month, so we should see it within a week's time.
Yeah, and to your second question, maybe just for potential simplicity, if you'd like to reach out related to the parks update, if you want to direct your inquiries through myself, I mean, clearly we'll need to connect with the community services staff who are heavily involved in leading that, but maybe I can just help navigate the process for you if you have questions or comments.
I can turn it back over to Glenn. Obviously, if there's any subsequent questions and stuff, that's why we're here, to work with town staff to answer any questions that you might have at this stage. Obviously, subsequent, there'll be a lot more dialogue. And as I say, we will be communicating in steps to release the information and have subsequent presentations.
Yeah, that's great. And thank you so much, Gary, for that. Paula in advance had indicated an interest in speaking, so we've just promoted you, Paula. Maybe I'll start with Paula, but if anyone else in the attendees list has an interest in asking questions, providing comments, if you could just use the comment function to let us know, then we'll promote you as well, and we can have a bit of a queue after Paula. But Paula, the floor is yours if you'd like.
Thank you, and I appreciate being promoted. It's good to see all of you. Happy New Year, and it's good to see you're all well. Gary, special hello to you. This is all very helpful. I recognize that there's no figures for us to chew on yet, and that's going to all come out as part of the background study, and we'll wait for that before we decide how we at Build will react or be a part of the process, because as you know, we normally like to gather a few of our key developers together, and if we need to retain any consultants to make sure Gary stays on point, we're happy to do that, but we're not going to jump the gun on that until we get some more information. So this is a great process as well. I appreciate the way you've done this and how you've been forthcoming with letting us know that the information's coming ahead. And then yes, on the parks piece too, I do see the relation now to Bill 197 and all that. We're very engaged at Build on all the park land reviews that are happening across the GTA, aside from the development charges. So when you're ready, and we've done some work on that, when you're ready, we're happy to have that discussion with you guys as well. So it's really a thank you, and we look forward to the continued discussions, and we're happy to be a part of this iterative process with you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, and we do appreciate your time this morning as well.
Thank you.
To the other attendees, I'll just maybe pause for a moment here if anyone else would like to have the floor for a moment, since we are a little bit ahead of schedule as well, so we might free up some time for everyone this morning as well. But maybe just last call if anyone else would like to ask either questions or provide comment. Okay, seeing none, we appreciate everyone's time this morning. We will post information up on the Let's Talk page, including some of the points and suggestions from this morning. February 11th, I think will be definitely a bit of a lengthier conversation, as we'll have some figures for you at that time about capital costs and the points that Gary noted. So we look forward to that discussion, and throughout, if there's questions, feel free to reach out, and we're happy to provide any insights that we can and hear any feedback that you may have. So thank you for your time, and we'll see you on February 11th.
Be safe.
Thanks, Gary.